Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Psalm 84, Joy in the Temple of God. We begin with the superscription for the choir director on the Gittit, and we've seen that term before. The word itself seems to be connected either with the city of Gath or maybe just an association with the term Gath, which means wine press. Maybe this is an instrument that looked a little bit like a wine, like a bellows. I'm not sure. But it's mentioned in Psalm 8 and again in Psalm 81 and finally here. And so those are the times we're going to see it. This is also described as a psalm of the sons of Korah. And Korah had been, the family of Korah, the sons of Korah had been the priestly musicians mentioned in First Chronicles chapter 6. And we've seen in Psalm 22, not 22, 42, 42, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, and 49, a whole collection there that were also Psalms of Korah. And you say, well, what happened to Psalm 43? That was left out. I believe that Psalm 42 and 43 were originally a single psalm. And if you go to the lecture there, we talked about that, and we'll explain why I do think that that was originally one psalm. So that whole collection were Sons of Korah. And now, again, we're going to start a new collection here, starting with Psalm 84, and we'll get 85. We're going to skip 86. You say, well, is that because it's connected to 85? I don't think so. I'm not sure yet, but 86 will have its own superscription. Psalm 43 did not. So I think it was clearer there. If that's part of the same thing happening here, I'm not sure. But from 84 to 88 will all be Psalms of the Sons of Korah, excluding Psalm 86. And we'll try to figure that out when we get there. We're ready for the psalm to begin now. How lovely are your dwelling places. And of course, this is temple language, and the entire psalm. In fact, I would suggest all the psalms of the sons of Korah have a temple theme connected to them. We'll see that as we go there. But right now, how lovely, or can I say, instead of how lovely, lovable are your dwelling places? That would work as well. O Lord of hosts. And we're going to come back and look at that phrase, Lord of hosts, because we're going to see that a number of times here in this short little psalm. My soul longed and even yearned for the courts of the law of the Lord. Remember, again, that's his dwelling places. That's the temple theme. My heart and my flesh sing for joy. And this is why we call it joy in the worship at the temple. They sing for joy to the living God. So this is temple language, just setting it forth right now, the idea of it. Verse 3, the bird has also found a house, and the swallow a nest for herself where she may lay her young. You say, okay, we start off talking about the temple. All of a sudden, did the psalm go to the birds? No. This is, I think, the dwelling theme, and it's talking about the dwelling of the temple. So birds have their house. Now, I don't think it's saying the birds are in the temple. I think this is rather sort of taking the idea and giving a graphic image of of an animal, in this case a bird, a swallow, that have finally come home. And they found a home. They found a nest for herself where she may lay her young. And then that's likened, even your altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. That is, the temple is God's home, but we're going to extend that a bit to God's people as well. Look at verse 4. How blessed are those who dwell in your house. Now, that term blessed, I'm going to give you the Hebrew here. It's ashrei. And the only reason I mention it, not because that's so significant, but because I'm going to have a little bit later a different word. We're going to see ashrei mentioned a few times, but we're going to have a different word that's used for blessing or blessed. And two different terms that have sort of the same meaning. Here, if I wanted to be more specific, instead of how blessed, I might say how happy. Remember how Jesus says in the Beatitudes, now that's Greek instead of Hebrew, but he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn. We could have rendered that happy are the poor in spirit, happy are those who mourn, and so on. Same idea here. Happy are those who dwell, but notice again, the temple theme, who dwell in your house. They are ever praising you. And then we have this term Selah. Now, is that a musical notation, a pause? Take it for either one or maybe both. But I think it's also giving us a little break where we're going to go to the dwelling theme to a different theme when we go to the next verse. So we saw here in verse 4 how blessed or how happy are those who dwell in the temple. And when we get to verse 5, we're going to see how blessed or happy, same term, is the man on the way to the temple. So he thinks about the temple, he thinks about dwelling in the temple, but now he's on his way to go there himself. Let's look. Verse 5, how blessed is the man, and Ashrei Adam is the word for man, same word for Adam back in Genesis chapter 1. But here it's just, blessed is the man, or somebody said mankind. I guess I just like to keep it simple. So happy is the man whose strength is in you, speaking to the Lord, in whose heart are the highways of to Zion. Notice the strength and the heart, that's sort of the same thing. Um, but notice they're on their way, the highways to Zion, and our translators have tried to be helpful here. So they added the word Zion. I think they're right, except that don't be quite so helpful. I think we could have figured it out on our own that we're talking about traveling to the temple. So this is that traveling theme, traveling to the temple to worship. Verse 6, and we see more of that traveling idea, passing through the valley of Baca. And the problem with the Valley of Baca is we don't know where that is. We know a number of valleys in and around Jerusalem. There is a Becca Valley, which sort of spelled the same way, but that's way up in Lebanon. That's not here. I think it might be a different valley that has the same name. The Valley of Baca, actually, literally, this is probably having the idea of the Valley of Weeping. But we're not weeping as we go there right now. Notice, passing through the Valley of Baca, they make it a spring. So valleys, what would happen is when it rains, water would flow. Water always goes downhill, so it would flow down into the valleys, and it would make a waterway. I think that's the idea here. And so we understand that by the next line, the early rain also covers it with blessings. Now, notice that phrase, early rain. Now, that takes a little bit of explanation because in Israel, they have a rainy season and a dry season. And the early rain is when that rainy season begins. It's not like it rains a little bit and then shuts off. No, it rains and then a little bit more, and that's in the wintertime. So starting around October, you might sprinkle a little bit and a little bit more in November, a little bit more in December, and January is the height of their rainy season. And that's a good time because they'd have the dry season in the summer, and everything had gotten brown and looked like it was going to die, and you hope that the rainy season is going to kick in eventually. And when it does, notice the early rain covers it with blessings. That's great. Now, when it finally rains, now it's time for things to grow. And notice the term blessings here. I told you there was a different word that was going to be used. And this is our old friend Barak, although this is the plural, so not blessing singular, but blessings plural. So Barakot is just the feminine plural ending there. And so the rains have come, and now that tells me if this is a traveling theme, they're traveling right close to when the rainy season is going to begin. That tells me why they're going to Jerusalem. You see, there were feasts in the spring, like Passover and first fruits, and then a little bit later there came the Feast of Pentecost. But in the fall, there were some other feasts, and the very last one in the fall before the rainy season hits is known as Sukkot. Sometimes we refer to it as the Feast of Tabernacles, where for a week the Israelites were going to leave their homes and they were going to camp out, and very often they would come to Jerusalem and camp out there. And I think that's the picture here. They're coming here to camp out, to be there at the place of God at the temple. I can't help but think of John chapter 7 and John chapter 8, where Jesus comes to Jerusalem at the Feast of Tabernacles. That's the Feast of that feast there, Sukkot. And verse 7, they go from strength to strength. Every one of them appears before God in Zion. So here we do have Zion mentioned. Our translators were trying to be helpful back in verse 5, but here it is mentioned before God in Zion. They're showing up here uh, at Zion, at Jerusalem, to worship the Lord, to be happy. It's a very joyous feast. as they remember that time where they did not have homes, and now they're sort of going back to the old ways, back to the wilderness, they don't travel to the wilderness, but re-experiencing that by living in these booths, in these tents, in these temporary dwellings, to remember a time when they didn't have a dwelling of their own. But that's not all. There's going to be other things that are going to be remembered as well. Verse 8, O Lord God of hosts, hear my prayer. Give ear, O God of Jacob. And now we have another Selah, ends this traveling theme, ends this short section. We go now to verse 9. Behold our shield. And let me just say, the traveler is going to arrive. Behold our shield. Now, shield is a defensive weapon, and so behold, notice behold, because he's going to say in the next line, look. So behold our shield, O God. So we have a shield, we have that which protects us, and then you're going to say the same thing in the second line with different words. So behold our shield, O God, and look, just like behold, but notice, look upon the face of your anointed. So, what is the shield? I'm going to suggest here, I'm stepping out a little limb here. I think we have parallelism here, synonymous parallelism. What is the shield? It is the face of your anointed. That's our old friend Mashiach, although it's your anointed, so it's Mashiach. Uh, it's your anointed. So look upon them. Now you say, well, what anointed are you referring to? Or is this a messianic psalm? I think ultimately it is, but initially, when you arrive at Jerusalem, what anointed one are you going to see? You're going to see the priest. But in this case, he's called our shield and your anointed one. Here's not just a priest, this is somebody special. This is somebody who acts as a shield, as a savior, as a protector of God's people. Does the priest do that? Well, maybe, but I think there's something larger at work. Okay, verse 10, for a day in your courts is better. And so this is temple language, the courts of the Lord. They've gotten there, they've arrived at the temple. And notice, a day in your courts is better than 1,000 outside. Now, would you rather have a day to live or 1,000 days to live? And yet, it depends on the quality of the day, doesn't it? And so that's what the psalmist is saying. A day in your courts is better than 1,000, and our translators have added the word outside. And I think that's the idea here. I would rather stand, and notice, one is good, but the other is better. A day is good. In fact, a day is better than the outside. I would rather stand at the threshold of the house of my God than dwell. Now think about this, standing at the threshold, that means you're not dwelling that in the house. You're standing like outside, not in the courts to be sure, but still standing outside, then dwelling in the tents of wickedness. And remember, they're dwelling in tents at this point, um, because this is a temporary dwelling. But he says, I'd rather stand in the threshold of the house of my God. That's better, just like the day in your courts is better. That's better than dwelling in the tents of wickedness. Verse 11, the traveler is still there. He arrived in the previous verses. For the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord gives grace and glory. And again, I think this is synonymous parallelism. You say, what does the sun and the shield represent? I think it represents grace and glory. We saw the shield mentioned previously with the Messiah, the Holy One, the Anointed One. That's what the word Messiah means. And this it's all describing the same thing: the sun, the shield, the grace, the glory, the Messiah. Also the shield there. So it started and sort of ends with shield as well. No good thing does he withhold from those who walk uprightly, in contrast to I'd rather dwell in the tents of wickedness. No, I don't want to do that. Here is, by contrast, the upright. And now, verse 12, we come to a close. O Lord of hosts. Now, we've seen this phrase a few times. The Lord of the word hosts, Sabaoth, is Lord of armies. Now, we don't always use the word host that way. We think host, I'm serving as a host to a party. No, no, no. This is the Lord of armies. And he was mentioned in verse 1 and 3 and 8 and again now in verse 12. And each time that title is mentioned, I think what we have is a different aspect of this experience of worship and joy and travel to the temple. So we saw it first in verse 1 where the psalmist desires to go to the temple. And then we saw it in verse 3 where he sees the temple as a home. Remember, like the birds have their nest and they have their home, and the temple is a home too. And then we saw it again in verse 8, verses 5 through 8, where he's on the road to the temple, and then he arrives and he worships at the temple, and the Lord of hosts has been marking his way from beginning to end, from desire to seeing it as a home to being on the road to finally getting here. It is the Lord of hosts who has been worshiping. And then we come to the last line: how blessed is the man who trusts in you. And that term blessed again is actually how happy is the man who trusts in you, because God is trustable. Now, we look at those four aspects: desiring to go to the temple, seeing the temple as home, on the road to the temple, arriving and worshiping in the temple. And we're reminded that we have one who stood in the temple and said, these were words of prophecy: destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. And people have taken Jesus' words both there and usually in similar places and thought, well, maybe someday God's going to come back and rebuild the temple. I don't know about that, but what I do find, especially in John chapter 2, verse 19, where it says, where Jesus says those words, John explains it in the next verse and says, but he was speaking of the temple of his body, where he is the temple. And so, as we read through the psalm, and we've been seeing the psalmist and his love for the temple, we can also look at it in a slightly different way and see that this is also speaking of the Messiah, who is the shield, who is the temple, who is the place where God dwells, and he has provided a home for us. We are on a journey even right now to see him. Yes, we've trusted in him, but one day we're going to see him face to face. And when we arrive, we will worship at the temple. We will worship the one who is the temple of God.